There is a moment in every relationship where the entire dynamic can change, and it usually doesn't happen when you say more. It happens when you stop chasing. Think about that for a moment. Most people believe that if someone is pulling away, the solution is to move closer. If they become distant, you send another message. If they stop communicating, you explain yourself more clearly. If they become cold, you become warmer. If they hesitate, you try harder to prove that you're trustworthy, loving, patient, and committed. And psychologically, that makes perfect sense, until you understand what it actually creates. When you continuously pursue someone who is withdrawing, you can unintentionally teach them that they can create distance without experiencing the natural consequence of losing access to you. Every time they step back and you immediately step forward, the pattern becomes reinforced. They withdraw, you pursue. They feel overwhelmed, you reassure. They create space, you close the space. Eventually, the relationship isn't being governed by mutual choice anymore. It's being governed by reaction. And that's why one of the most powerful things you can do is not another message, not another explanation, not another attempt to convince them. It's to become emotionally grounded enough to stop chasing. Now, this doesn't mean playing games. It doesn't mean pretending you don't care. It doesn't mean disappearing to manipulate somebody into missing you. And it certainly doesn't mean becoming cold because you want to punish them. There's a profound difference between withdrawal as manipulation and distance as self-respect. Manipulation says, I'm going to disappear so that you panic and come after me. Self-respect says, I care about you, but I will not continue abandoning myself to maintain a connection that requires me to chase. Those two behaviors may look similar from the outside, but psychologically they are completely different. The first is still controlled by the other person. The second is controlled by your values. And that distinction changes everything, because when you stop chasing, you remove the constant emotional pressure from the interaction. You stop trying to manage their feelings. You stop trying to predict their reactions. You stop making their distance the center of your emotional universe. And now something very interesting can happen. They have to experience their own choice. As long as you're constantly pursuing, they can focus on your behavior. They can think they're texting too much. They're asking too many questions. They're expecting too much. They're becoming emotional. But when you step back with dignity, there is no longer another person carrying the emotional responsibility for the relationship. They are left alone with their own behavior. And sometimes that's where the real psychological confrontation begins. Because distance can feel very different when you choose it than when somebody else chooses it. An avoidant person may be comfortable creating space because space gives them a sense of control. It allows them to regulate their discomfort. It allows them to reduce the intensity of emotional closeness. But when the person they expected to remain available stops pursuing them, the meaning of that space can change. Suddenly, the question isn't, how do I get them to give me more space? The question becomes, what if they don't come back? And that's a completely different psychological experience. Now we have to be careful here. Not every avoidant person will suddenly return. Not every person who withdraws is secretly terrified of losing you. Human beings are complicated, and attachment patterns are not mathematical formulas. But one principle remains powerful regardless of attachment style. People often recognize the value of access when access is no longer guaranteed. If someone knows you'll always be there, they may take your availability for granted. But when you establish boundaries and stop over-functioning in the relationship, the other person gets an opportunity to understand the consequences of their choices. And more importantly, you get an opportunity to understand yourself. Because this isn't really about shocking the avoidant. It's about waking yourself up. Ask yourself honestly, how much of your behavior has been motivated by fear? Fear that they'll leave. Fear that they'll forget you. Fear that someone else will replace you. Fear that if you don't send the message, they'll never send one. Fear that if you don't explain yourself one more time, they'll misunderstand you forever. Fear can make intelligent people behave irrationally. It can turn love into surveillance. It can turn communication into begging. It can turn patience into self-abandonment. And the moment you stop allowing fear to dictate your behavior, your entire presence changes. You don't need to become louder. You become clearer. You don't need to become colder. You become stronger. You don't need to convince someone of your worth. You begin living as though your worth was never up for negotiation. That's what emotional independence really means. It doesn't mean you don't need people. It means you don't need another person's temporary attention to determine your permanent value. And that's a philosophical shift, because the healthiest form of love isn't, I need you to choose me so I can feel worthy. It's, I choose you because I value you. But I will still choose myself if the relationship requires me to betray who I am. That is a completely different foundation for love. And here's where this becomes especially important. When you stop chasing, you create clarity. You learn whether someone actually wants to participate in the relationship or whether you were carrying the entire connection. You learn whether their silence was temporary or intentional. You learn whether their feelings can translate into action. You learn whether there is mutuality. And sometimes the answer will hurt. But clarity is still better than living inside an illusion, because you cannot build a healthy relationship with potential alone. You cannot build it with memories alone. You cannot build it with chemistry alone. You build it through consistent choices. And if someone wants a relationship with you, eventually their actions have to meet their feelings. That's why stopping the chase is not about making someone miss you. It's about making room for reality to reveal itself. Maybe they step forward, maybe they don't. But either way, you gain something valuable, truth. And once you have truth, you can make a decision. You can stop asking, how do I make them choose me? And start asking the question that changes your entire life. Is the relationship I'm receiving worthy of the person I'm becoming? That's the real transformation. Because the moment you stop chasing someone else's validation, you begin pursuing something far more important, your own integrity. And that is where your power returns. You don't walk away because you stopped caring. You stop chasing because you finally understand that love should be an invitation, not a negotiation. Stop chasing what requires you to abandon yourself and watch what becomes clear. And once you stop chasing, something even more powerful becomes possible. You begin to understand the difference between loving someone and losing yourself inside the relationship. Because this is where many people get confused. They think that if they love deeply enough, give enough, understand enough, forgive enough, and remain patient enough, eventually the other person will feel safe enough to stay. But love doesn't work that way. You cannot love another human being into emotional readiness. You cannot sacrifice your boundaries until someone suddenly develops the capacity for intimacy. And you cannot prove that you're safe by becoming endlessly available. In fact, sometimes the most powerful demonstration of emotional security is the ability to remain connected to someone without becoming psychologically dependent upon their response. That's what shocks a person who is accustomed to emotional distance. They may expect closeness to come with pressure. They may expect affection to become demands. They may expect vulnerability to become emotional dependency. They may expect that if they give someone an inch of intimacy, that person will immediately demand a mile of reassurance. But imagine encountering someone who operates differently. Someone who says, I care about you deeply, but I don't need to control you. Someone who says, I want closeness, but I don't need to possess you. Someone who says, I can communicate what I feel without demanding that you immediately fix it. Someone who can establish a boundary without turning that boundary into a punishment. That kind of person creates a completely different emotional environment. Because now love isn't experienced as a cage. It's experienced as freedom with responsibility. And that distinction is psychologically profound. You see, emotional maturity isn't the absence of needs. It's the ability to have needs without making another person responsible for your entire emotional stability. You can want reassurance without demanding constant reassurance. You can miss someone without abandoning your life. You can love someone without making their attention the measure of your worth. You can desire commitment without trying to force commitment. And when you operate from that place, you become emotionally grounded. You're no longer saying, give me what I need or I'll collapse. You're saying, I know what I need, I know what I offer, and I know what I will and will not accept. That's strength. And here's something important. Boundaries don't push healthy people away. Healthy boundaries reveal people. They reveal who can respect you. They reveal who only liked you when you were endlessly accommodating. They reveal who wants connection and who wants control. And they reveal something about yourself, too. They show whether you're willing to honor your own values when honoring them becomes uncomfortable. Because it's easy to have boundaries when everyone respects them. The real test comes when setting a boundary might cause someone you love to become disappointed, distant, or angry. That's where many people surrender. They say, maybe I'm asking for too much. Maybe I should be more patient. Maybe I shouldn't bring this up. Maybe if I just understand them a little more, they'll eventually give me what I need. And sometimes patience is wisdom. But sometimes what you call patience is actually fear wearing a respectable disguise. You're not waiting because the relationship is healthy. You're waiting because you're afraid to accept what the relationship is telling you. That's why emotional independence is so important. You need the ability to look at someone's behavior without immediately creating excuses for it. Not because you're cynical, because you're clear. If someone needs space, you can respect their space. If someone needs time, you can give them time. But you don't have to put your entire life on hold while they decide whether they want to participate in it. That's the difference between compassion and self-abandonment. Compassion says, I understand that you're struggling. Self-abandonment says, because you're struggling, my needs no longer matter. Those are not the same thing. And if you truly want a healthy relationship, you need to understand that distinction. Because the person who remains emotionally grounded communicates something powerful without saying a word. My love is available, but my identity is not negotiable. That message can be deeply confronting, especially for someone who has learned to associate intimacy with losing autonomy. Because now they encounter closeness without suffocation. They encounter affection without manipulation. They encounter commitment without control. They encounter boundaries without hostility. And suddenly, the old psychological story begins to weaken. Maybe closeness doesn't automatically mean losing freedom. Maybe being loved doesn't mean being controlled. Maybe vulnerability doesn't mean becoming powerless. Maybe someone can care about me without trying to possess me. That's why your emotional stability can be more influential than your emotional intensity. Intensity gets attention. Stability creates safety. And safety doesn't mean endlessly tolerating poor treatment. It means creating an environment where honesty, autonomy, accountability, and mutual respect can coexist. That's real security. But there's another layer to this. When you stop trying to convince someone that you're valuable, you create an opportunity for them to discover your value through experience rather than persuasion. Think about the difference. If you're constantly explaining why they should appreciate you, you're trying to control their perception. But if you simply live according to your values, your character becomes the evidence. You don't have to announce that you're confident. You demonstrate it through your decisions. You don't have to announce that you have standards. You demonstrate them through what you refuse to tolerate. You don't have to announce that you love deeply. You demonstrate it through consistency, honesty, compassion, and integrity. And you don't have to prove that you can live without someone. You demonstrate it by continuing to build a meaningful life, regardless of whether they are temporarily close or distant. That is what it means to love without losing yourself. And here's the paradox. The less desperately you need someone to choose you, the more authentically you can choose them. Because now your relationship isn't based on fear, it's based on freedom. You're not saying, I need you because I can't be whole without you. You're saying, I'm whole and I still choose to build something meaningful with you. That's a much stronger form of love. And if the other person can't meet you there, that doesn't mean you failed. It means you discovered a truth. You cannot create mutuality by yourself. You can create an invitation. You can create safety. You can communicate clearly. You can offer love. But the other person must walk through the door. So don't make your mission getting someone to stay. Make your mission becoming the kind of person who never has to abandon themselves to keep someone close. Because the ultimate form of emotional power isn't being able to make someone chase you. It's being able to love deeply while remaining completely anchored in who you are. Love deeply, but never disappear inside the person you love. And now we arrive at the third realization, and perhaps the most confronting one of all. What happens when the person you thought would remain emotionally affected by your absence discovers that your life is not ending without them? Because this is where the dynamic can change completely. When someone becomes accustomed to your emotional availability, they can begin to unconsciously assume that you will always be there. They may not consciously think this person will wait forever, but patterns create expectations. If every withdrawal is followed by your pursuit, if every period of silence is followed by your reassurance, if every moment of distance is followed by you trying harder, then eventually your availability becomes predictable. And predictable availability can be taken for granted. But what happens when that pattern ends? What happens when you don't collapse? What happens when you don't beg? What happens when you don't spend every waking hour trying to decode their silence? What happens when you take the emotional energy you've been investing in someone else's uncertainty and redirect it toward your own life? That's when something powerful happens. You become visible to yourself again, and that matters more than whether the other person notices. Because sometimes people spend so much energy asking, how will my absence affect them, that they forget to ask, what is their absence teaching me? That's the question that changes everything. Maybe their distance teaches you that you were relying too heavily on external validation. Maybe their silence teaches you that you were confusing inconsistency with mystery. Maybe their withdrawal teaches you that you were accepting less than you actually needed. Maybe the relationship teaches you that you were so focused on being chosen that you forgot to choose yourself. And that is where growth begins. You see, strength isn't proven by how dramatically you can make someone regret losing you. Strength is proven by how completely you can rebuild your relationship with yourself. Your routines, your goals, your friendships, your creativity, your discipline, your health, your purpose, your peace. Because when your life becomes larger than the relationship stops being the foundation of your identity. And that changes the emotional equation. You're no longer sitting around waiting for someone to decide whether you are worthy of their attention. You're living, you're creating, you're becoming. And eventually you reach a point where you can honestly say, I would love for this person to be part of my life, but my life does not stop if they aren't. That is freedom. And freedom is often uncomfortable because it requires you to release the illusion of control. You cannot control whether someone misses you. You cannot control whether they come back. You cannot control whether they finally understand what they lost. You cannot control whether they develop the courage to become emotionally available. But you can control what you do with the experience. You can decide whether rejection becomes resentment or wisdom. You can decide whether distance becomes desperation or development. You can decide whether heartbreak becomes an identity or a chapter. That's the philosophical shift. Stop asking, how do I make them realize my value? Start asking, how do I live in a way that honors my value whether they recognize it or not? That question puts your power back where it belongs. And here's something else that matters. When you grow, you don't necessarily need to announce it. You don't need to post things designed to make someone jealous. You don't need to display your happiness as a weapon. You don't need to manufacture a new identity just so someone from your past notices. Because if your transformation exists primarily to get a reaction from them, you're still emotionally connected to their reaction. You're still performing for them. Real transformation is quieter. You start waking up earlier because you have somewhere meaningful to go. You become disciplined because you respect your future. You become healthier because you value your body. You pursue your goals because you finally understand that your life deserves your attention. You stop checking whether they're watching. You stop wondering whether they noticed. You stop needing evidence that they regret losing you. And eventually, something extraordinary happens. You don't need them to regret losing you anymore. That's when you know you've changed. Because the goal was never to make someone suffer because they walked away. The goal was to become so rooted in your own life that their decision no longer determines the quality of yours. Now, could that change affect how they perceive you? Absolutely. Human beings notice patterns. When someone who was once constantly available becomes centered, independent, and emotionally composed, the contrast can be noticeable. But don't make that your objective. Because if you transform yourself solely to trigger someone else's attachment system, you've simply exchanged one form of dependence for another. You used to depend on their presence. Now you depend on their reaction to your absence. That's not freedom. Freedom is when their presence can add to your life without becoming the condition for your happiness. And that's also where you gain clarity about whether reconciliation is actually worth pursuing. If they return, don't ask only, did they miss me? Ask, what has changed? Missing someone is an emotion. Building a relationship is a behavior. Someone can miss you terribly and still be incapable of giving you a healthy relationship. Someone can regret losing you and still repeat the same patterns. Someone can love you and still be emotionally unavailable. That's why you must look beyond feelings. Look at consistency. Look at accountability. Look at communication. Look at willingness to grow. Look at whether their actions finally match their words. Because your job isn't to reward someone simply for coming back. Your job is to evaluate whether what they're bringing back is healthy, to deserve another place in your life. That's maturity. And if they don't return, then your growth still matters. Your healing still matters. Your life still matters. Because you didn't become stronger for them. You became stronger because you finally understood that your future was too valuable to place in someone else's hands. That's the lesson so many people miss. Sometimes the greatest consequence of losing someone isn't that they eventually miss you. It's that you eventually stop needing them to. You stop waiting for an apology. You stop waiting for an explanation. You stop waiting for proof. You stop measuring your worth by someone's ability to recognize it. And suddenly, the question changes from, why didn't they choose me? To why did I ever believe their choice determined my value? That is the moment you reclaim yourself. So if someone is pulled away from you, don't spend your life trying to engineer their realization. Build your life. Strengthen your character. Clarify your standards. Protect your peace. Become so committed to your own evolution that whether they return or remain distant, you continue moving forward. Because the most powerful message you can ever send isn't, look what you lost. It's something much quieter. It's the life you build when you finally stop waiting. Don't become stronger to make them regret losing you. Become stronger so their regret no longer matters.